I'm Andy.
And I'm Lara.
And you are listening to Curious Systems.
Even my nan says that the system is broken, but what does that mean? What's broken and how can we fix it?
To answer those questions, we're going to be inviting in a different guest each episode to explore a curious system. It'll be someone who knows the system from the inside and can help us answer those questions. So today's curious system is housing. Lara, how do you connect to this personally?
I think that most of us do, because we usually have our own story. I've had quite an interesting relationship with housing. I grew up with quite stable housing, a stable home, everything I might need. But when I had my children, I lived for a short while in a women's refuge, and then from there went into the homelessness system with 2 children. So I was moved around from a few different places because temporary accommodation, and then got a house with a housing association. And what I found with that was that at the time, I don't really think that they felt that my house was my home. And because of that, several things happened that made me feel quite insecure in that home. So people making changes to my home without my knowing, coming in when I wasn't there, doing repairs that were, well, you wouldn't want to live with them in, the people doing the repairs wouldn't wanted to have lived with them in their home. And what that seemed, I think that's done, and really actually having some of these conversations around housing has really cemented that for me, is that it has taken away some of my confidence in home. So even though I've owned my last 2 properties, I could just as easily live in a hotel. I don't have that connection, and I'm wondering how many other people that affects. I had a really big conversation with a friend at the weekend who also had a very unconnected to home childhood, who now values their home above everything and really has a strong sense of home identity. So I don't think it affects, like so much in the system, people can have a really similar experience but react to it in a very different way. How about you? What's your sort of home story or house story?
So probably for about the last 10 years, when people ask me about my home situation, I've described it as a cross between Fight Club and Carry On movie. And the reason for that is that me and my wife were lucky enough to be able to buy a home. And when we bought the home, it had squatters in, and it was completely trashed. And so there's a very long road to trying to do it up. And some bits were done with professional builders, some bits were DIY. But we also had a lot of people coming to stay with us and help us build. So there's a couple of websites, so a bit like Woofing, that's kind of working on an organic farms thing, but for buildings. And so we met a really broad cross-section of people from probably about 10 different countries.
Wow.
So we had a lot of people stay with us for anything from 2 weeks to 2 years. And it was fascinating. At points really, really annoying, but it was fascinating. And I think it's probably made a difference to what we do now, in that we are now foster carers. And one of the things that gave us the confidence to make that jump was that we realised in some cases it had been a bit like fostering adults. So some people are fine and, they've kind of got life together and just want a bit of a change. Other people were definitely running away from something that was often something traumatic. And so suddenly, without knowing someone, they've turned up on your doorstep, and gradually these things get revealed, that there's other sides to their life and their personality and why they are where they are. Yeah, big learning experience. So home for me, I guess, leans towards chaotic and inclusive.
That's quite a tricky thing, because a lot of the time when people close their front door, they close a lot of that out. But you sort of opened your life and your home to that. How do you think that's changed how you feel about home?
I think it's really good. I think it's good doing this work because some of the system stuff feels quite heady and cerebral, and I get to talk to lots of nice people, yourself included, but often people who are, running organisations in the social space or kind of positive purpose space, trying to make the world a little bit better. And it keeps me in touch with the reality of life, and that reality is messy. Yeah, it's maybe not the most restful always, but I don't know. It's right for us for now.
Andy, tell us a little bit about our guest today that's going to talk to us about housing.
Sure. So our guest today is John Swinney. John is someone who's worked in the housing space for a very long time, predominantly social housing, so a lot of work with local authorities and housing associations, a lot of work on boards. He is currently the chief executive of Just Housing Group, but he combines that role with a lot of work as either a chair or a member of a board of different types of organisation. And a lot of those organisations are essentially working with people who are on lower incomes, probably can't afford a house on the private market either to rent or to buy. And I think one of the things I get from John is he's such an includer of people, so he really believes in those services being good services. Regardless of who you are or where you've come from, housing's such a basic thing. I mean, it's a fundamental human right, and it should be good. And so what I see in John's career and his work history is trying to make sure that it's good for everybody.
There's quite a different in perception to I'm a owner, I'm a renter in social homes. What people think about that and the way that the narrative has changed quite dramatically about that from when my parents were getting there.
Probably Margaret Thatcher. It's been going down that hill ever since. But now there's a recognition pretty much with everybody we've got to build more social housing because it's just not worked. It's quite interesting actually because one of the things I do, I'm sort of a part-time chief executive of a for-profit housing association called Major Housing Association. We've got 3 projects on the go with the GLA, grant funded by the GLA, and we're just finishing our first property in Seven Kings, which is 58 homes. And the quality of the work is fabulous. It's 85% EPC-A, which is 50 odd homes. That's as many as most of the big landlords in this country have in November. Mm-hmm. Whether that has a difference in the context of what you've just been saying, Lara, about how people feel about the product, what they're living in, because it would be right up there. I mean, if it was in Knightsbridge, you'd say, blimey, this is a nice place that I'd go and live in there, in that sense, because the quality of what we've done is fantastic.
That's kind of what I'd like to see every home being something that everyone would want to live in.
I'd be proud of, and everything else.
Because that's what it's for.
Because when we started Pinnacle, which is a long time ago now, one of the sort of the driving forces was if you provide a good enough service, people will be proud to live in those properties. And a lot of the issues around damage and vandalism and all those sorts of things would go away because people didn't want their properties messed up. They wanted, that whole pride in community and all those things. That sort of underpinned what we were always trying to do. And I think we did have some success, but I think that whole sort of ethos around that sort of way of working or way of providing services has just disappeared over the last 10 years or so. And I just think that's the way to bring it all back. So you sort of rethink all the things we've been talking about, start to look at the whole thing in a different way. Yeah. But it requires courage from landlords. It requires courage in terms of letting the residents have a real and genuine say in the service. It requires courage around how they start to go around procuring contracts, whether it's repairs or major works or whatever. It requires courage in how do we help our leaseholders because they can't afford what we're trying to do for them.
Yeah,
it's
a big cultural change.
Yeah, massive cultural change. The sector at the moment, I don't think really knows where to go with it. I'm sure they'd all tell me that's wrong, but
it shows up in behaviours, doesn't it? Because that also makes me think about pride and the good function of pride, like being proud of your work, proud of where you live, caring about your neighbourhood and your neighbours, caring about the work that you do. So it should be something that grows out of mutual respect, and it sounds like a positive cycle that raises, so everyone has higher expectations, everyone's more bought into what's going on. As a contractor, you don't turn up and dump something on the lawn of the property because you couldn't be bothered to figure out what the deal was with waste collection or organise a skip or whatever it was that it would have taken. And so you can go up or you can go down. But if you can get some of those very human emotions, like I want to live somewhere that's decent.
But how do you have pride without trust?
That's what I'm wondering.
In any culture that you were trying to build, they absolutely go hand in hand. So if you want to be proud of the place that you live in and the community that you live in, but someone else has the power and doesn't trust you with the power, that's going to fall away.
With it all as well.
And that's very much how it was, when people started making those repairs to my home, and I've been really, it was absolutely my home. I lived there for 19 years. My children grew up there. It was my home. It had marks on the wall that said how tall my kids were in the kitchen. It was my home. What it did was it detached me from that. And that power made me feel like that home belonged to someone else. And therefore, not only did they not have a responsibility to me, but I didn't have a responsibility to them. And I was far less likely, a lot of people, and I really looked after it, and then would go, yeah, but I'm not going to do that because it's not mine. And I wouldn't have said that years before. I would have always done the work.
Social housing, when it first started, the tenant would clean the steps. They
were hard to get.
Absolutely, they were special properties,
Yeah.
And that's all gradually gone, dissipated, whatever. It's just not there anymore. So the part of all of this is to rebuild pride in social housing at a national level, and not think it's that's the worst of the worst, the lowest of the low. And there is a perception that's what it is.
I do think all that language of deserving and undeserving, which we should have done away with well over 100 years ago, has come back into public discourse massively in the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
And then that starts to be seen, even the language around local housing allowance or housing benefit or council tax benefit. There's some of those words might have had a neutrality to them, but now it's often perceived negatively as a cost to society, as if people being sick or not having decent homes wasn't a huge cost to society. So it's completely false economy. It's seen as something that should be cut rather than something that we should be proud of.
And then you come into temporary accommodation, which is crippling local government in this country, and nobody's really got a solution to it. Everyone's chasing whatever homes they can get hold of to put people in. But most people are in temporary accommodation, like hotels or whatever. All the trouble, all those recent riots, they were all around temporary accommodation, or a lot of them were.
What does that do to a person? We're thinking about the importance of what home means to us. It's a very human need.
Yeah.
On Maslow's hierarchy of needs for psychology, having a secure home is fundamental base for us. What does it do to people when you don't know where you're going to be from one moment to the next, that you're in temporary accommodation that is by its very nature not very pleasant to live in? And what happens when there is a push to try and get rid of that? Are you moved into properties that aren't much better, but just means that you're off that list? Where's the plan for it?
When you start saying about councils building more council homes, I'm really interested in that, because it's often said in terms of, we need more homes. The other sort of less visible truth is that we've got more rooms per person in this country than at any point in its history, and so we've actually got a distribution problem.
Yeah.
And
that's been around for a long time, Andy.
So I'm curious with what your take is on how fast can stuff be, not how fast can stuff be built, but to what extent is it building it, to what extent is it reallocating it. Some councils start to look at buybacks. Do you buy a home when it's empty? If a private landlord leaves the market, if you buy that as a council, instead of paying temporary accommodation rates that are through the nose, well, what if the council just owned it? Now, of course, you've then got those small properties with in different places with a certain amount of management hassle. How well maintained has it been? What if there's a problem with the plumbing? All of that. But nonetheless, can councils have, or the state have more agency to manage some of that overflow of needs that they have?
That is happening. So lots of councils are buying properties back where they can. GLA is funding schemes for refugees, which gives people grant to buy homes back. So there is a lot of that going on. But to be honest with you, the numbers, the difference, it's just sort of, what's the expression?
Drop in the ocean.
Yeah, drop in the ocean.
Yeah.
And then you have got all the issues then around management, which they're not, councils haven't got the resource anymore. Councils have been destroyed over the last many years. And, some of the things that they would do easily and comfortably, they just can't do now. They just don't have the number of people or the levels of competence required for it.
If they've been hollowed out,
they have
that sort of 80-20 split from keeping 80% of the money and spending it locally to 80% of it going back into central government and then maybe coming out in drips and drabs.
You throw that into the melting pot with all the other issues we've been talking about, as you can see why housing is such a mess. And it's not, everybody sort of say, well, change the planning or change this or change that and make it. No, you have to change, you have to rethink the whole thing, in my opinion anyway. You can fiddle around with different bits and they'll have a marginal difference, but they're not going to change the sort of the overwhelming sort of way that services are delivered and everything. It's just not going to do it.
It's like we're still stuck in seeing it as a mechanised system rather than a biological or ecological one. So we've been talking about people, individuals, households, folk who live in homes, and then the systems, so these big organisations, contractors, councils, and I'm wondering what's in the middle, whether it's organisations, whether it's groups of residents, whether it's a mezzanine layer that could make a difference. Because I also think it's where some of the resistance happen. You see people campaigning on an estate to stop it being redeveloped insensitively. You get neighbourhood watches, you get all sorts of different groups of concerned residents. And so I think some interesting stuff happens that's maybe local or neighbourhood, or it's beneath the level of the whole of the local authority with 10, 20, 30,000 homes, depending on which one you're talking about, beneath the level of the housing association, which is in similar numbers all the way up into 6 digits, 100,000 homes. But is there something that middle layer that's interesting or creative?
There is. You're absolutely right. Well, yeah, I think it's interesting because I also think you then there's another dynamic, which is the big housing association, which sort of presses against that, because what's tended to happen in the housing association movement over the last 10 years probably is that they've just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and the bigger ones have just sort of consumed and gobbled up so many of the small ones. And I'm not sure whether any of those sorts of things are important to them anymore. So that middle layer, I'm just not sure that for those people and for those organisations, and we're talking about 100,000 home organisations or bigger, what counts? What's important to them now? It's investment, it's how much money they make, it's compliance and all those things, because they're under the cosh for that. But I'm not sure how much, and they talk about resident engagement and those things, so I might be doing them a disfavour, but it doesn't feel to me like they've got that sense of purpose around that middle bit that you talked about.
Very hard to be locally rooted if you're that scale.
Yeah,
just
absolutely. And you're all over the place. You're not just in a particular community or area. And then you go to some of the much more community-focused organisations, which can be big, 10,000 homes, something like that. And their focus is the neighbourhoods, the green bit, all of that sort of stuff. Community days and knocking on doors and making sure. And I'm not sure you can do that when you've got 100, 200,000 homes.
Yeah. And then
so size is a factor in all of this.
Yeah, because relationships, there's only so many people you can know. So this trust thing, it's running around in my head, because I like what you said about the NHS. So I think a lot of people in this country feel a certain amount of trust of the NHS as an institution, even as we know it's imperfect. So you can feel trusted institution, but then what you experience, because the other thing is we trust people. So who do you know, and what do you know about them? So trust, if it's too big, you just can't know that many people, and then you lose the relationship.
So you've got the Margaret Thatcher thing, right to buy and all that stuff, and then you've got the second issue that's really changed social housing, which was how much cost is in the service. So cost, call centres and all that stuff, and then taking away the local office, which lots of places are now going back to for that very reason. And if you can't touch people, it's a special service. You can't do the NHS. You can't save people's lives without being close to them. You can't provide a good housing service, in my opinion, if you're not close to them. Or not a good social housing service. So I think trying to apply stuff around private rented and, how we do insurance and all those sorts of things to social housing isn't right. And, everybody talks about we've got to have lots of different channels of communication. So you can report a repair on the phone, you can report it to the local office, you can report it on a portal and all those different things. But when you look at most of the numbers, still the phone call is like 90% of all. So they're doing all these other things to try and sort of diversify the ways you can report a repair or whatever it might be, antisocial behaviour or anything. But they're not really working.
To come back to this idea of power and trust and culture, is that it's a really difficult thing to change that culture of kind of the very traditional hierarchical bean counter measuring everything and being the fear of kind of failure model, which I think exists in a lot of big organisations because of control, because you need to have a certain level of control in a big organisation, and it's difficult. To turn that around into one where the culture is of trust, letting people do the thing they're good at, opening up to the outside world, and actually I would say the people living in the homes that you have is not the outside world, it's the inside world, but bringing that in that kind of trusting way. I wonder if there are any good examples of that, even if it's on a not quite there scale or sort of in the middle of those things, or where anyone's seen any kind of green shoots of hope around that. And why is it so difficult?
Well, I'll tell you my thought, which I've pondered on a lot recently, partly because I've been in hospital recently. You sort of get a real live view of the NHS, which is full of unbelievable, just amazing people and doing amazing things, and then just rubbish. Rubbish, and particularly in terms of administration, organisation and everything else. And if you ask people in this country about the NHS, everybody, almost without exception, is proud of what we have.
Yeah.
No one's proud anymore of social housing. So I think there is part of the debate, or what needs to happen is we need to lift social housing out of being a place of last resort for people to being something that we are proud of. And if we start taking pride in something, that over time will lift how it's perceived and seen. And until you lift how it's perceived and seen, it's not going to get any better. You can't deal with that pride thing unless we believe in it. And it's a very important part. So, you've got basically 3 tiers of housing: the homeowner, the private rented, and the social housing. And they should all be seen as they're different things for different people at different points in time in their life. But we're proud of all of those things. Then you get left with what we're going to do with temporary accommodation. But I think you part that and come up with something completely different for that, which I think is a lot of it about funding and everything else. But I think if you could lift how people saw social housing, that would start to make a difference.
Yeah, it would turn a lot of those things you were talking around with just kind of with one change.
Yeah.
So my question is, how do we start that?
Because Starmer needs to start it. I mean, the politicians have to start it. People have to start to say, we're proud of this. And it's gone downhill since Margaret Thatcher. And that's not a political comment, it's just a product of where she drove everything. Right to buy, social housing is not a good place, you don't want to be in social housing, you want to get out of social housing. That's what people need to aspire to, as opposed to, I love social housing, let's live in it, let's have that whole community thing and everything else. We have to change the narrative if we're going to do anything in terms of tackling the culture issue, I think.
I'm really interested in sequence and scale in that, so I've got a lot of sympathy for saying where it starts at the top. Talk about it, something we're proud of, invest in it accordingly, which I think is the other problem that we've touched on already. But then I also wonder about the scale. So you can do from the top, but then I also wonder how it works from the bottom, that people are proud of where they are. Maybe it's a sort of frivolous example, but does anyone plant flowers outside where they live or not? Then if someone stands on the flowers, you're kind of annoyed, you tell them not to. But it's almost like we've got this very big system butting against one that wants to be, in some cases, smaller or at least more local. So I don't know, I suppose my question is, are there other things that could be done at a more local level? And what would that look like? So earlier you said, well, leaseholders been given bills of 70 to 100 grand. If you had 50 grand per house on an estate, and you said to all of the residents, make a plan with this money, by the way, your plan, try and think 50 years in the future. I don't know what would happen at that scale, but I just wonder if there's something in the middle between the individual and then the whole of the system with the big contractors, the local authorities.
What you're saying is that government funding of whatever, this is what I think you're saying, that government funding, whatever that may be, in terms of quantum, could only be unlocked if the residents came up with a plan for it, nothing to do with the landlord.
Yeah, as a thought experiment, rather than a system where the housing managers and the architects and the contractors and all these other folk are making the decisions, and then you get asked, but what does this place need for the next 50 years? Because if you're proud and you want it to be good and you want it to be good for the people who come after you, does that start to change something?
That's an interesting idea. Because typically it is just around, you'd have a community chest of £50,000 for, 1,000 properties. So that does nothing. Mm-hmm. You'd have to have 50 million or more, which you could unlock based on that long-term plan. But it would be a really interesting thing if you start to say, residents make the plan, residents get the architects in. Then I guess people would start saying, well, what do you need the landlord for? Or maybe you need the landlord for something different, something that's not traditional, it's much more empowering and steering. It's a bit like a board. Maybe the landlord should be more like a company board where it's about steering where the direction of the organisation going, not controlling and doing it at a day-to-day level. That's the executive. So maybe
you're checking for pitfalls, aren't you? Because that was the other thing I was hearing was the risk bit, and there's some things where you don't want to be left to chance. Fire safety being very good example. You want to know it's done really well and really, really properly. Some people hear, oh, let local communities take control, like, oh, but things won't be done right. But that's more like, a board provides a framework, and some of those safety standards are there, and the organisation is well led, and it can spot whether it is or it isn't, and intervene if it's an effective board.
Yeah, and it's interesting because at some point in time, those residents won't have the time to do that. So that's always been one of the arguments that the landlord has had. Well, they've all got jobs and they can't do that, or they don't really know what they're doing. They don't have the level of competence or expertise. That tends to be one of those two things that sort of landlords will say, that's why we have to do it. But I do think you could sort of think about a different. So, and maybe you did that around neighbourhoods. So each neighbour had its own board, which was which is sort of where they are with resident committees, but those resident committees don't have any power, they don't have any influence. So if you devolved the budget with some extra money that you could get if you came up with a really good plan, maybe that would be an interesting, even if you did it. See, I think you have to get confident in a new way of doing things. So you have to pilot things, you have to have some experiments. Yes. And you could try something like that in half a dozen places in London, and Birmingham, Leeds, Manchester, wherever, Liverpool. So you could, and I think you would pick on the big cities, but you could also have some rural projects. You could start to really think, and you could almost set terms of reference. Right, you come up with how you're going to do it differently, as opposed to saying everybody's got to do a pilot around these same things. And you set your targets as something around transparency, pride, and those things we talked about earlier as being the template that has to underpin whatever you're coming up with as a solution. Let's get lots of different ideas going. That would make the whole thing exciting, wouldn't it? Which is also what I think you should do with the NHS, but that's a totally different thing.
Well, it's funny, I think when you find a kind of a turning point for one system, there's often a lot of learning about it for another system, isn't there? And it's not just enough, I think, for people to change the narrative, because the narrative won't change on its own.
No.
And we've seen how that has changed from one of pride at the beginning of council housing to one of almost shame. I think don't think that's too big a word, actually. I think there's something shameful currently about living in social housing. To turn that around, I mean, I know there's some really good, Joseph Rowntree and the Nationwide Foundation are doing a lot talking about home and talking about identity. But actually, they're people who are already invested. How do we get everyone out there to change the narrative from the council estate person, like that's a bad thing, to I have a council home or I have a social home and it's a home. How do we put the emphasis back on home, I suppose? And by doing experiments like that, by showing what happens when it works, I think it makes that narrative much easier to get out to a much broader population.
I agree. You're trying to force a system on a sort of a cohort of people that aren't necessarily, because you've got to remember, most of them tend to be old, lots of mental health issues, all those sorts of things.
And huge diversity.
A huge diversity.
Multiple
languages, all of that stuff. And yet you're trying to force a system that's essentially what we use for car insurance.
Yeah, and then we're bringing the imagination of the marketplace in, and there's a lot of other assumptions in there, including you can shop around, which fundamentally isn't true if you're in an affordable home, because you've got to hang on to the one that you've got.
So what should it be more like if it's not insurance?
Well, for me, I would, as a cost of it, I would go back to more local delivery of services through people that are local. And I think that's how you have that whole thing around community pride and everything else.
So there's something around pride and community, pride and trust, pride and control. So your community have some control over that community.
And I think relationships and resources is the other one I'm hearing, that the relationships need to be local.
So some of that is quite bottom up, isn't it? The kind of the community stuff, the control things, they need to be on a very localised level. And even if you've got a huge housing association, you can still have communities within it.
Yeah.
But there also has to be the top-down change of culture that supports that, allows that to happen, and gets people to view social housing as an equal tier to other so that your home is your home, and it doesn't matter what that looks like, where that's from, how you pay for it. It's somewhere that you live and love and have your family, and that those two things have to work, I think, in conjunction with each other, and that's a good start to a change in the system. There's a lot there that we can do. We're gonna wrap up for today, but I think we could have carried that on for about another 6 or 7 hours.
That'll be the unedited version.
I wonder whether we should rename this Putting the World to Rights with the Curiosity Society. But it's been amazing to have you talking to us and eating biscuits with you and putting the world to rights today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I very much enjoyed it.
I really enjoyed that.
I love talking to John because he can take something really, really complicated and make it really, really accessible. And I can understand everything that he's saying. But also he's so passionate about what he does. And he's never allowed the complication or the complexity of that system to get him down.
Yeah, it reminds me of why I've always enjoyed working with John, because it always comes back to quite practical stuff and neighbourhoods and communities and people's experience and quality of life. So what do you think you're taking away from the conversation? Or what stood out?
There's a couple of things. There's the way that people and property are kind of separated in some cases. And I don't think that's right across the whole system. I think that it depends where you are in that, like what type of housing you have or what your home looks like. When you take people away from that, but then the power of what can happen when you put those things back together, when you put the power back in the hands of the people who live in the homes, rather than someone who's kind of managing it, what can happen then? So I've definitely taken that away from that conversation. And I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see a little bit more of that in other conversations. Don't know.
The other P for me was pride.
Oh, yeah.
So as well as people and power. Yeah, that really got me thinking, the comparison with the NHS. It's a much loved national institution, even though it's struggling and even though it's got its imperfections. I just think I've not heard anyone else talk about housing in that way. It's such a good thing and it's such a necessary thing. And of course there are people who are proud of their neighbourhoods and proud of the place they come from. But how do you get pride at top and bottom and all the levels in between? So you can be proud of it in an institutional sense as well as proud of your patch, your place, your neighbourhood.
Tell you what it really reminded me of was my grandmother. It's the same grandmother who said, it's the system that's broken quite a lot. So she obviously really knew what she was talking about. But she told me the story of when she got her first home after the war in Harrow, and it was a 3-bedroom prefab house.
One of the ones they built in a rush, was it?
Built in a rush, still standing today, worth an absolute fortune, amazingly. Her and my granddad moved in there with their, I think then 3 children. They had 6 children. My dad was born in that house. And she said that when she got there, she thought they'd made a mistake because the whole thing was for her. She'd been in 2 rooms with 1 sink that was shared with the whole flat of people because she'd been bombed out. And she couldn't believe
It's
the
not
whole
realised-
house was for her. She
Oh,
couldn't.
there's-
No, and she sat on
okay.
the stairs and she cried because she couldn't believe that she had this given to her. And when they moved out, they were offered to buy it, and they would not, because they said that every family needed to have that. And we were always brought up with this really strong thing that if you're given a council house, you love it because it's an honour that you've got somewhere for your life and for your family. And it just really reminded me of that, that pride they had. Like their lawn was always perfect. My granddad was always in the garden doing something. One of my grandma's phrases is "dust is my enemy," and that huge amount
Not
of
when you
kind
take
of.
it to heart, all right.
I have not taken that to heart one little bit. Dust is just a covering furniture for me, but it's just lovely to kind of hear that sort of thing. And it's how do you. I don't particularly like evoking the past all the time. I don't think the past was better than the future. I always think the future can be better. But there are some wonderful things about pride in your home. And the country was proud of that. And the government was proud of that. And to me...
So Homes for Heroes was the narrative.
Absolutely.
And a lot of what John was talking about was the kind of Thatcher years onwards, so really 80s, 90s, noughties up to where we are now. Yeah, it's a very different narrative.
Yeah.
That was something that needed to be provided, where there's a huge amount of political will, and actually got political parties competing with each other to build more and better council homes. So yeah, it's a long time since we've been in that paradigm. So I'm with you. I don't think it's nostalgia. I think it just shows the conversation can be very different to what we've had recently.
Narrative and systems, I think, is a big deal because the people in systems have to believe in the change. You can't just change the system without them. If you're curious about the Curiosity Society, you can find out more at curiositysociety.org.